My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 67 years old, and the only reason I discovered what my daughter-in-law was hiding from everyone, including my son, was because she stole my watch and accidentally exposed a secret my husband took to the grave. She thought she was just getting away with something small, something petty, a quick grab for cash to help her latest little business project. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this watch held more than gold and sentimental value. It held a message my husband had hidden from everyone, even me. And when the jeweler called and told me to come in right away, I could tell by the weight in his voice that something was very wrong. When I arrived, he looked me in the eye and said, "Ma'am, you need to see what was hidden inside this watch." And that moment changed everything I thought I knew about my family. It was one of those Saturdays where the air feels too quiet, and every sound, every ticking clock, every creak in the floorboards seems louder than usual, like the house itself is holding its breath. I had just finished folding a fresh stack of laundry and was reaching to put away a set of napkins when something strange caught my eye. The old jewelry box on my dresser sat slightly ajar. That box had been in the same spot for years, and I never left it open. Not once. I kept only one thing in it. Just one. My husband's gift to me on our 25th wedding anniversary, an elegant, understated Cartier watch with a thin gold band, the kind that says more with silence than a dozen diamonds ever could. He gave it to me back when time still felt full of promise, when we thought we'd grow old together on our own terms, with matching rocking chairs and morning coffee on the back porch. I walked toward the box slowly, almost like I didn't want to see what I already knew. The watch was gone. For a second, I just stood there, staring at the empty velvet lining, one hand on the edge of the dresser, the other still holding a clean dish towel like I'd forgotten how to move. I checked every drawer in that bedroom, twice. I opened the coat closet, looked under the bathroom sink, even went through the laundry again. But deep down, something heavy settled into my chest. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't age. This wasn't me misplacing something. That watch hadn't gone missing. It had been taken. Only 2 people had been in my house the night before, my son Jason and his wife Samantha. They'd come for dinner, if you could call it that. Samantha had brought some store-bought lasagna and acted like she'd cooked a feast, and Jason had barely said a word all evening, glued to his phone like a teenager. Samantha had floated around like she owned the place, commenting on the curtains, asking what I planned to do with the house in the future, and at one point even joking that the watch would look cute on her display shelf. I remember laughing politely at the time, brushing it off, but now it all made sense. She'd been casing the place like it was a showroom. I wanted so badly to believe I was wrong. I clung to the idea that maybe I'd left it somewhere odd, that maybe I'd taken it off and set it on the kitchen counter, or dropped it into a drawer without thinking. But as the hours dragged on and every possible hiding place came up empty, I could feel it in my bones. She had taken it. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to call Jason and accuse his wife. I didn't want to open that door just yet. But then, just after 3 that afternoon, my phone rang. It was a number I hadn't seen in years. Mr. Harrington, the elderly jeweler who'd handled all our family pieces. He used to work closely with my husband Thomas before Thomas passed, and we hadn't spoken in ages. When I picked up, his voice was warm but cautious. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "someone brought in your watch today. I recognized it instantly. I thought you should know. And there's something else, something inside it. You really should come by." I barely remembered driving. My mind was spinning so fast that I left the house in my slippers and didn't even bring a coat, even though the air had turned cool and gray. When I walked into the shop, the old wooden bell above the door gave its familiar little chime, and there he was, Mr. Harrington, standing behind the counter with a velvet cloth laid out in front of him. My watch was sitting on it, slightly scuffed on the back, like someone had tried to open it with something sharp and careless. He didn't say anything right away. He just lifted his eyes to mine, filled with something I couldn't read. Sympathy? Worry? Regret? and handed me a small plastic sleeve containing a tiny folded note. The paper inside was yellowed with age, the handwriting faded but unmistakable. It was Thomas's. I don't remember sitting down, but suddenly I was in one of the chairs by the counter, the note trembling in my hands, my eyes swimming with emotion I couldn't even name. Mr. Harrington quietly explained that while inspecting the watch, he discovered a hidden compartment in the caseback, one he'd never seen before in all his years repairing fine timepieces. And tucked inside that narrow cavity, tightly pressed against the inner gears, was this note. It must have been there for decades, and that's when it hit me. Whatever Thomas had hidden inside that watch, he had never meant for anyone else to find it. Not me, not Jason, and definitely not Samantha. But now that it was in my hands, there was no going back. The past was about to resurface, and the truth, well, the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Not when time itself is on your side. I sat there in the quiet of Mr. Harrington's shop, clutching that folded slip of paper like it might dissolve if I breathed too hard. And for a long moment, I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. The store around me faded into soft blur. Old clocks ticking in uneven rhythm, velvet boxes stacked neatly behind glass, the distant sound of wind against the door, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat, loud and slow like thunder muffled under water. My hands trembled as I unfolded the note, not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I could already feel the shift in the air, like something sacred was about to be broken open. The handwriting was unmistakable, steady and strong, with the kind of careful strokes my husband used when he was trying to say something that mattered. It was dated March 14th, 1979, long before we ever discussed wills, lawyers, or retirement plans, and it was addressed simply to Eleanor, if you ever need to know. I didn't read the whole thing there, not in front of Mr. Harrington, not with my heart threatening to give out and tears already welling behind my eyes. I tucked it gently back into the sleeve, pressed the watch into my coat pocket, thanked him with a barely audible whisper, and walked out into the fading afternoon with the weight of years pressing down on my shoulders. The moment I got home, I made a pot of tea. I never drank. Sat down at the kitchen table where Thomas used to read the paper every morning and opened the letter under the weak light of the hanging lamp. And that's when I saw it, plain as day, his confession. He had written that if anything ever happened to him unexpectedly, there was a reason I should keep the watch close. He had suspected even then that someone might try to manipulate Jason once he was older, that money and property could become tools for control. He never named names, never pointed a finger, but he mentioned trust, how easily it can be given, how quickly it can be twisted. He said the real will, the one that reflected his wishes before pressure from the family lawyer and outside influences changed it, was hidden somewhere only I could access, and the first clue was inside this note. He even apologized, as if he'd failed to protect me from something he couldn't name back then. And I just sat there staring at his words, feeling the world tilt slightly under my feet. For all these years, I thought the watch was just a gift. I never imagined it was a message in plain sight, waiting to be discovered when the time was right, or when someone foolish enough tried to take what didn't belong to them. And that someone was Samantha. She'd only been in our lives for a few years, but somehow it felt like she'd always been there, wedged into the quiet spaces of our family like a thorn in a soft blanket. I still remember the first time Jason brought her home. She was beautiful in that curated, icy way that made you wonder how long it took to look effortless. Polished nails, perfect smile, the kind of voice that always seemed half amused, like she knew something you didn't. Jason, my sweet, serious boy who once cried when he found a baby bird in the yard, had transformed around her. He became sharper, quicker to snap, eager to impress but less present, like he was always looking for approval that never came. I knew from the start that Samantha had grown up differently. Private schools, expensive hobbies, parents who didn't believe in idle time. She once told me, with a little laugh, that she'd never washed a dish by hand until college, and even then, she paid someone to do it after the first week. I smiled back then, but something inside me curled. At first, I tried to welcome her. I really did. I invited her to cook with me, to help decorate the house for Christmas, to sit and talk over coffee while Jason ran errands. But every time, she kept her distance. Not rude, just politely detached, like she was humoring me out of obligation. She asked about our finances far too often, always wrapped in the guise of future planning. Will you stay in this house long-term, Eleanor? Or, have you considered downsizing and gifting early to the next generation? She smiled when she said it, every word dipped in honey, but it chilled me. I could tell she saw me as someone occupying a seat she thought was already hers. And then there was the matter of her new business. A boutique, she said. Something modern, empowering, full of imported goods and clever branding. She'd been talking about it for months, claiming to have investors lined up. But every time I asked who they were, she gave me vague answers. Jason never seemed to know much either. I'd catch him frowning at spreadsheets on his laptop, looking more worried by the week, and I began to suspect that whatever money was backing this dream, it wasn't coming from anyone outside the family. I just didn't realize how close to home it had come, until that watch disappeared. Sitting at my kitchen table, the note still open beside me, I felt a quiet anger settle into my bones. Not rage, not fire, but the slow, cold kind of anger that grows roots. I had been patient. I had been gracious. I had given them my time, my home, my Sunday afternoons and birthday cakes, and still they saw me as a soft target. Samantha thought she could steal from me, and I'd never notice. She thought the past would stay buried, that Thomas's secrets would die with him, that the watch was just an accessory she could cash in for startup capital. But what she didn't know, what she never bothered to consider, was that I still had allies in places she couldn't imagine, that not everyone in my life had forgotten who I was, that I may be older, slower, and quieter than I once was, but I am not weak. And now I had the truth. I had the letter. I had the watch. And for the first time in years, I had a reason to stop sitting in silence, because Samantha thought she'd taken something from me. But what she really did was give me the key to everything. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with the letter resting on my chest, the watch tucked beneath my pillow like a sentinel from another lifetime, and my mind running in endless, tangled circles. Every word Thomas had written echoed louder the darker the room became, each sentence pulling another memory from the corners of my past. Connecting dots I hadn't even known were part of the same picture. I thought about all those late evenings he'd spent in the garage under the pretense of organizing old tools, about how he always took the watch off and set it face down on the workbench like it was something more than a timepiece. I thought about the time he'd gotten into an argument with his brother over a property deal and afterward told me almost offhandedly, "Sometimes people close to you aren't on your side." I thought about how, toward the end when the illness was making him quieter and thinner, he'd still touch my wrist gently whenever I wore the watch, like he was reminding me not to forget. Now I understood. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I drove downtown to the law office we used back when we first created our estate plan. The same building, the same heavy oak door with the polished brass plate, and to my surprise, the same receptionist, though her hair was now streaked with gray and her voice softer than I remembered. I asked to see Mr. Adler, the lawyer who had drawn up Thomas's last will and testament. She frowned and explained that Mr. Adler had retired, but his son, now a partner in the firm, handled all of his father's legacy clients. Within 15 minutes, I was seated across from a well-dressed man in his early 40s who looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and something else, respect, perhaps, or maybe suspicion. I laid the note gently on the table between us, and when I told him where I had found it, I saw his eyes widen just enough to betray his calm. He took the letter, read it twice in silence, and then disappeared into the records room for nearly an hour. When he returned, he carried a worn, leather-bound file and a thin manila envelope. What he said next shifted something permanent in me. There was an original will, he began carefully, placing the documents on the table, drawn up in 1985. It named you, Mrs. Whitmore, as sole beneficiary of your husband's estate. House, savings, personal property, everything. But in 2002, a revised will was filed that split the estate equally between you and your son. It included clauses about future distribution to grandchildren and asset control in the event of incapacity. We assumed your husband changed his mind and filed the new version accordingly. I stared at him, my pulse thudding. And what if I told you he never meant to file the second one? He leaned back, steepled his fingers, and said, "Then we may be looking at a case of undue influence, possibly fraud, depending on who pushed for the changes and under what conditions. But to challenge it legally, we'd need corroborating documents or direct instructions from the original testator." I reached into my bag and pulled out the folded envelope Thomas had stashed behind the letter in the watch. A second note I hadn't opened until that morning. Inside was a detailed list of assets, handwritten instructions, and a name I hadn't heard in years. Mr. Gerald Cohen, a retired accountant and friend of my husband's from his Rotary Club days. Thomas had entrusted him with a backup copy of the original will, stored in a secure location should anything ever go sideways. The letter ended with one line that felt like a whisper through time. If she finds this, she'll know what to do. And I did. The lawyer looked at me with new eyes then, like I'd just moved a piece on the board he didn't even know I was playing. He promised to begin a quiet investigation into the will's history and to discreetly contact Mr. Cohen if he could be found. I left the office feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not grief, but clarity. The fog that had settled over my world since Thomas's death, since Jason drifted away, since Samantha moved in with her expensive perfume and tight-lipped smiles, that fog had finally begun to lift. And beneath it, I could see the outlines of what needed to be done. That evening, I invited Jason and Samantha to dinner. I told them I missed their company and wanted to have a family night, just the three of us. Samantha texted back within minutes with a chirpy, "Of course, we'd love to," followed by a string of heart emojis that meant nothing and said everything. I spent the day cooking their favorites: roast chicken with lemon and thyme, mashed sweet potatoes, the green bean casserole Jason always asked for on Thanksgiving. I lit candles, set out the good plates, wore the blouse Thomas had always said made my eyes look brighter. I greeted them at the door with a smile so warm it should have set off alarms in Samantha's head, but she was too distracted by the scent of garlic and the sound of jazz playing low in the background. She walked in like she owned the place, as always. Dinner was smooth, too smooth. Jason seemed more relaxed than usual, maybe because he assumed the missing watch had been forgotten, or maybe because I hadn't brought it up. Samantha complimented the food, asked if I'd seen the new space for her boutique, even hinted at a big investor who'd stepped in last minute to help her fill the gaps. I nodded politely, said little, and kept pouring wine. And when dessert was done and the table cleared, I handed Samantha a small velvet box, the kind that once held jewelry. Her eyes lit up, hungry and eager, and she opened it without hesitation. But instead of diamonds or gold, inside was a neatly folded copy of Thomas's original letter, the one I'd found inside the watch. And taped to the inside of the lid was a photograph of the original will, notarized, signed, sealed, and dated. Her smile vanished in stages, like a light slowly dimming, and she stared at me as if she were seeing me for the first time. I held her gaze without blinking. "You might want to read that carefully," I said softly, "before you make any more plans with someone else's money." Jason looked between us, confused, until he saw the signature on the document and realized it was his father's handwriting. I watched the blood drain from his face like a tide pulling away from shore. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. She thought she could take from me and walk away untouched. But she didn't just steal a watch. She opened a vault her charm couldn't close. The next morning felt different. Even though everything around me looked exactly the same, the curtains hadn't moved, the air still smelled faintly like lemon polish, and the old wall clock in the hallway ticked in its usual rhythm. But somehow, the silence in the house carried a different weight, like it knew something had shifted, like the walls were holding onto a secret too. I stood in the kitchen with a warm mug of coffee between my hands, trying to settle my nerves, even though I hadn't really slept. Not out of fear, but because the truth was finally rising to the surface, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Not now that I had seen the letter, not now that I knew Thomas had left behind more than memories. I met with the lawyer again that morning, the son of the man who had written our original will so many years ago, and by noon we had everything moving. Quietly, carefully, and legally. The petition to challenge the updated will was written and filed, based on the documents I had pulled from the watch and the testimony from Thomas's old accountant, Mr. Cohen, who, to my surprise, was still alive and just as sharp as he'd been 30 years ago. He told me he had always suspected something wasn't right with the revised version filed after Thomas got sick, but without direct instruction, he had kept the original sealed in a fireproof safe all these years, just in case it was ever needed. Now it was, and the moment I held that notarized original in my hand, I knew I was done waiting, done sitting back while others decided what I deserved. I didn't want to let the legal process play out on its own while I sat in silence, so I started preparing myself, reviewing bank records, organizing old receipts, pulling property documents from dusty drawers and file boxes I hadn't touched in years. I wasn't angry in the loud, bitter way people expect from betrayal. It was a quieter kind of rage, the kind that sits deep in your chest and hardens into resolve. I moved slowly, deliberately, like a woman who finally understood what needed to be done. And then, once everything was ready, I invited Jason and Samantha to dinner. I made it feel like any other family night, told them I missed them, told them I wanted to cook something special. I roasted a lemon thyme chicken, baked sweet potatoes, and made the green bean casserole Jason always asked for at Thanksgiving. I even set the table with the good dishes and wore the blouse Thomas used to love, the one with tiny embroidered flowers around the collar. When they arrived, Samantha looked around with that same too-sweet smile she always wore, like she was walking into a space that was almost hers. And Jason looked tired but calm, maybe thinking the missing watch had been forgotten or that I had finally decided not to make trouble. Dinner went smoothly, maybe a little too smoothly, filled with polite conversation and empty compliments. Samantha chatted about her boutique, mentioned some big investor stepping in at the last minute, and Jason just sat there, nodding along, sipping his wine like he was hoping to get through the night without anything uncomfortable happening. And when dessert was done and the table was cleared, I stood up, walked over to the sideboard, and returned with a small velvet box. I placed it gently in front of Samantha, watched her face light up the way it always did when she thought something valuable was about to land in her hands, and waited. She opened it without hesitation, expecting something shiny, something expensive. But what she found instead was a folded copy of Thomas's original letter and a printed image of the will he had written before illness and pressure changed everything. The color drained from her face as her smile collapsed slowly, piece by piece, and I could see the panic behind her eyes before she even looked up. Jason leaned closer, saw the handwriting, and froze. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. That silence was all the explanation they would ever get. But the most unexpected moment came the next day, when everything almost fell apart. I had gone to the lawyer's office to sign the last batch of legal forms when I heard shouting in the hallway. A moment later, the door burst open, and there stood Samantha, no longer calm and collected, but messy, shaking, and furious, with papers clutched in one hand and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept all night. She marched into the room, dropped the documents onto the table, and began talking so fast and loud I couldn't follow at first, claiming I was destroying her life, accusing me of tearing the family apart, insisting that Jason and our grandchild would suffer because of me. She said she'd put everything into her business, that she had borrowed money, signed papers, made deals, and that I was undoing all of it with a single letter. For a split second, something in me faltered. Seeing her like that, frantic, desperate, raw, it made me wonder if I had gone too far. I remembered the early days when I had hoped she might grow into the role of a daughter-in-law who could be trusted, when I tried to include her in holiday traditions and weekend dinners, when I believed maybe love and time would make her softer. But then I looked down at the documents she had thrown onto the table and saw the forged signatures, the home equity loan taken out behind my back, the boutique plans built on stolen trust, and I felt that calm return to me like a wave, pulling everything sharp and painful out to sea. I turned back to the lawyer, signed my name where it needed to go, and told myself this was not about revenge. This was about reclaiming what was mine before someone else rewrote the ending of my life without asking permission. And as Samantha stood there breathing hard, waiting for some sign of guilt or hesitation, I gave her none. Because I wasn't the one who built this fire, but I had every right to walk away while it burned. Weeks passed like slow-moving clouds, each day folding into the next with the kind of heavy quiet that only comes after a storm has left its mark but hasn't quite finished its damage. I thought things would start to settle, that once the paperwork moved through the courts and the dust began to clear, I might finally exhale, finally return to some version of peace. But that didn't happen, at least not at first. Samantha disappeared from public view, retreating from the boutique she had fought so hard to build, blaming delays on contractors, then on health, then on family strain. The shop never opened, the shelves remained empty, and word started to spread, not because I told anyone, but because truth doesn't stay quiet forever, not in a town where people remember your smile one day and your silence the next. Jason stopped calling. I didn't chase him. I let the silence stretch between us like a narrow bridge no one was ready to cross. The documents had gone through. The house, the savings, the remaining property, all legally transferred back to me under the original terms my husband had written. It should have felt like victory. It should have tasted like justice. But something in it felt incomplete, like the final note of a song held a breath too long. I went about my days carefully, tending to the yard, baking more than I needed to, reading the same pages of the same book twice. I wore the watch again, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how fragile time can be and how dangerous it is to think anyone can own it. Then one early morning, as the sun was just beginning to stretch across the sky in muted shades of pink and pale gold, I received a letter that almost brought me to my knees. It was from a lawyer I didn't recognize, representing a private real estate group that claimed my home was now subject to foreclosure. I read the words again and again, not because I misunderstood them, but because they made no sense. The house had been transferred back to my name, clean and legal, the debts erased. How could this be possible? My fingers trembled as I pulled out the bank records, and that's when I saw it. Buried in the fine print of one of the loan forms Samantha had forged was a hidden clause, a transfer of lien authorization signed in Jason's name. It had been missed in the audit, missed by the lawyers, missed by me. Panic hit me in waves, but under it was something else, something colder. This hadn't been a mistake. This was a safety net Samantha had quietly installed for herself, a last rope tied around my neck in case everything else failed. And now it was tightening. I spent that entire day on the phone, lawyers, bankers, investigators, and with every call, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. It looked like she had sold the debt before the court ruling was finalized, transferring it to a third party to avoid legal reversion. No one had caught it in time. Now they were demanding full payment or the house, my house, would be taken. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't tell anyone. I just stood in my kitchen as the evening light turned the walls golden, knowing I had done everything right and yet still might lose the one place that held all the years I had loved, hurt, hoped, and survived. And then, just when I thought this was how the story would end, not with justice but with yet another quiet loss, I got one more call. It was from Mr. Cohen, Thomas's old accountant, and this time his voice held something I hadn't heard before, bare excitement. He told me that after all the chaos, he had gone back through the original archive one last time, and inside a separate file marked insurance, he found a second letter from Thomas, one that no one had seen. In it, Thomas explained that he had taken out a private policy years ago, not on his life, but on the house itself, protected through a legal shield trust separate from the estate in case of foul play or fraudulent claims. It wasn't triggered unless specific terms were violated, but now, thanks to Samantha's forged documents and illegal transfers, those exact triggers had been met. I could barely breathe. I asked him to email the file, then printed it and walked it myself to the courthouse the next morning. By the end of the week, the lien was voided, the foreclosure canceled, and the trust legally reactivated. The house was safe. The trap had snapped, but not on me. What happened after that unfolded quickly. Samantha was summoned to court for fraud. Jason was subpoenaed for testimony. The boutique lease was terminated by the landlord after 3 months of unpaid rent. And me, I stood in the back of the courtroom on the day the verdict was read, not out of spite, but because I wanted to see it through, to the very last line. The judge ruled in my favor on all accounts. Samantha would be fined, banned from business management for 5 years, and referred for further civil investigation. Jason walked past me without a word as he left the courtroom, and for the first time, I didn't look away. I held his gaze, not with anger, but with the full weight of everything he had chosen not to protect. That was his burden now, not mine. Now, weeks later, I sit in my living room as the afternoon sun spills across the hardwood floors Thomas once polished with his own hands. The house is quiet again, but it is mine. The watch is back on my wrist, ticking soft and slow, and I finally understand what Thomas was trying to give me all those years ago. Not just protection, not just warning. He was giving me the time to find my voice again, and now, maybe it's your turn. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply, only to find out they were building a life behind your back using the pieces you gave them? Have you ever been pushed aside, made to feel small, like your time had passed and your value had faded? I wonder, if you found a secret inside something you thought you'd lost, what would you do with it?